Okay, good morning again. This today will be the morphology and syntax section of the workshop. We're going to wait a couple minutes until there's people in the stream. Just waiting. So if you're in the chat, let me know. I'm going to try to pull it up on my screen so I can see it right quick. Maybe I can watch on. Yes, I can't see it. I think because I'm logged in, it won't let me see my own live video. All right, now I can see the comments too. So if I want to comment on that. All right, but that means I'll type as Leah if I type. Otherwise, I'll just answer the questions when I see them. Yeah. If people are starting to join the stream, just let me know, and once there's a certain number of people, we'll get started. Coming live at you from Hawaii. We're going to talk about word formation and sentence formation, two essential aspects of your descriptive project. Looks like I need to move over a little bit. I'll go off the side. Hi, good evening to you in Nigeria and Mexico City, which would be morning. Buenos dias. Good morning, Anna. Excellent. So we're starting to have a couple people join, just a couple more minutes, and we don't want to leave anybody behind once we get started talking about I need to hide that. So you guys can see the full thing. And we're going to work today from the handout instead of the PowerPoint, so I can write on the handout. You may have questions, and we can solve them together on the handout. Is the sound okay? This is too quiet? So just 2 or 3 more minutes, we'll get started. I hope everybody is having a good morning or evening, wherever you are. The sound okay? So we'll give it a sound test. So there's a small lag from my end. So if you ask a question, just wait a minute and we'll get to it. Small lag. Yeah. From my end. So if you ask a question. Oh yeah, we don't want to hear that back. Okay. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Looks like maybe 7 people are with us already. Hopefully a few more can join us, and if they join a little late, hopefully they don't get lost. Of course, you can ask questions at any time, but we will have a special question. As you guys know, if you've been following the seminar, we're going to have a question period at the end. But if you have a question at any time during it or a comment, as soon as I see it, or if I'm sitting here with Leah, if she sees one, we'll try to address that. Hi, good morning in Canada and good night in Pakistan. Magandang umaga to those in the Philippines. Somebody's having a problem with the links. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did.
Maybe we share the link right in the comment section.
Mm-hmm.
Several more people have just joined. So I think we're going to try to post the link right there so you can see maybe a little bit better. You can see all the way to the edge of that. So I guess we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll talk about words and sentences. I am Peter Schulke. I'm a linguist at University of Hawaii, and I specialize in morphology and syntax. When we talk about morphology, we're talking about forms, starting with morphology, and we'll move on to syntax. Morph and form are cognates. In fact, they went through a morphological process themselves where they did a switcheroo, FRM to MRF. So, morphology is specifically the study of word formation. In your descriptive documents, it's essential that you describe two things when you describe word formation. You want to describe the way sounds are affected in word formation. It's quite common that when you add things to a word and when you build a word up, the sounds that touch each other will affect each other. And this series of phenomena is called morphophonemics, the study of this phenomenon. So that is our first bolded title right here. I've highlighted that. So we're defining morphophonemic processes as the way sounds are affected in word formation. We'll talk about some examples in a second. But off the top of my head, I could tell you, just to get an idea, you can see that we have a kind of like in sound in English, where we do like words like inappropriate, and then it changes to an M, an important, and then it changes to a different thing before an F, information, just to show you a quick preview that the sounds always change depending on what they're touching in this particular example, which is meant to show that point. And the other major area of description should be about the way meaning is affected in word formation. It's a very general definition. It should help you, it should scaffold your description rather than define it. So when we talk about morphosyntactic processes, they can all be divided into two categories, roughly. Maybe you think of an exception. Derivational morphology and inflectional morphology. The point of your description should be to organize things into a way that helps both you, the writer, and the reader. It should help you make sure that you got everything you were trying to say. If you have an organized way, you can see what kind of progress you made. And if you organize things, say, into derivational inflection, it will help the reader access what you are trying to describe. So that was a preview. Oh, a small note on that. As you can see, I've got it here. Derivational morphology is morphological processes which change word classes and create new words. And inflectional morphology, roughly, is morphological processes which express grammatical information such as aspect, person, and number. So an example of inflectional morphology in English is third person singular agreement, on the verb. If I were to say I sleep, there is no agreement. I say she sleeps, you get an S at the end. That is a package of information telling you that the subject of that verb is third person singular. Conversely, that's maybe not the best example. Changing the word bad to badly might be considered derivational morphology, as you change it from an adjective to an adverb. Nailing the analysis exactly in your description is not nearly as important as organizing it in some principled manner. So the difference between derivational and inflectional is not crucial to your analysis, and sometimes it's tricky. Like the first example I thought of, the ing suffix in English. You say jump to jumping. Jumping could be a noun, or it could be a progressive verb. So it's maybe the ing can act as both. Okay, let's see. We have some more people just joined. All right, we'll start getting to the heart of our discussion. What is a word? According to our working definition, a word is a piece of language, something that you could say by itself or that you could use as part of a phrase or sentence. We could say that a word is made of morphemes, bases, and affixes. So I have just read what is on the handout. What is meant by bases and affixes is that when we're building words such as happy, unhappy, and unhappiness, we perceive that a certain part of the word unhappiness is more core. We perceive that to be happy. I believe most English speakers would agree with me. Happy is the core part. So we'll call it the base. Then you add things to it. So if you add an un, you get unhappy. If you add a ness, you get happiness. Un and ness are affixes. They cannot be used by themselves. They can only add to words. Now, this is a very good point. Do not be confused by the white spaces in writing. There's a big difference between writing and sounds are how you define a word generally. If you think back to the sound seminar, I'm sure that was touched upon. So I just gave you a hint at what a base is. I'm going to write notes in the document right now so you can see. We'll call that happy. Should be all lowercase. This would be our base. Base. 2 with a prefix. Oop, not prefiz, is prefix. Now I'm using, well, we're going to look at this again. I'm using a dash or a hyphen or a minus sign. It's all the same thing. After un to indicate that it's a prefix. This is a convention in linguistics. I recommend that you adopt it into your description so that you can distinguish affixes. So the first type of affix that we will discuss is a prefix. And after you know what kind of affixes there are, it'll be clear that affix is an umbrella term for all sorts of things that directly attach to words and generally cannot stand by themselves. Our next type is a suffix. It goes after. So a prefix goes before. In fact, pre in prefix is an example of a prefix. Yes. So you can see that the suffix in that is ness. Need a little dash before that. Of course, a word can have a prefix and a suffix in English, in probably many languages. All right, that's our notes now that you can have a prefix and a suffix. As was just shown, an affix is something that you attach to a word that cannot stand on its own. Now we have our example of prefix up there and our example of suffix. Looking at the word uncomfortable, you can see that the base, the core part, the part that stands on its own, the part that contains the meaning connected to something in the real world or the abstract world. But in this case, a bit of both with comfort, which is kind of an abstract idea that interacts. You can attach an un and an able. When we think about our sounds, our morphophonemics, we can see that the prefix un does not surface with an n in this situation, right? What we really get is a different kind of symbol. This is a website you can use to I2Speak to find characters quickly when you are writing. So if you want to find the symbol I'm looking for, an angma, just type in an N and select it. For the prefix un, let's make another set of examples here. The prefix un changes when it comes before comfortable. Comfortable appears to begin with a C based on orthography. Kevin just said that happiness is the core part of life. I agree. Un appears to precede a C because of orthography, because of writing. But if we are careful and we observe the sounds, we can say that comfortable begins with a K. And sure enough, the un from uncomfortable changes from an N to ung, a velar nasal, when it comes before a velar stop. This is a shorthand rule I've written in SPE style phonology, so old phonology, but the theoretical relevance is not important. This is just a description. So the un changes to ung before a K. So we don't say uncomfortable, we say uncomfortable. Maybe in the most careful speech, you would say uncomfortable. But in fast speech, virtually every speaker will say uncomfortable. This is a common thing in languages. So I would recommend that in the language you are describing, that you consider the class of nasal consonants and if they change when they are touching something. They might not, but it is a very common phenomenon across languages. Okay, back to the core topic of affixation. An affix can be used to mark certain grammatical functions. For example, it may show cars, desks, and teachers. The degree levels of adjectives: easier, cheaper, slower. Conversely, slowest is another suffix in the comparative level. Background information on the tense. This is past tense in English: asked, talked, developed. Now there's a sound aspect to these as well. Let's get some space under here. When you get cars, car might be better spelled this way. You don't get cars, you get cars. In the case of desks, let's say that that's the right vowel. It's actually spelled fairly similar to how it's pronounced. Indeed, there's another class in English. You need this symbol, schwa. For example, the word church will give you churches. Notice it is wrong to say churches, and it's wrong to say churches. You have to say churches. That's not a very good. We're going to get rid of the H's, and that would be closer to an orthographic convention. Maybe it's really, there's no vowel there. Just so you remember it's supposed to be. When it comes to easier, cheaper, and slower, I do not observe a sound change. There may be a small influence, but not one that you would necessarily need to indicate in your description. The past tense verbs also, the past tense suffixes, I should say, also change a little bit. So for example, talk, which ends in a, oh, let's make that regular. Talk ends in a K, so it gets talked. It appears to be ED in spelling, but in spoken language, it's a T, talked, talked. Let's see, this feed is potentially lagging, and if we were going to talk about it in past tense, we might say it lagged. Again, there's a special case. We have today maybe a chat. Together, we are chatting. These angled brackets mean that it's orthography. And then in our rough IPA now, looks like cat. Put this way, but it's chat. I'll get another symbol from here to clarify this. Maybe you should have done this with churches. Now we get chat. What happens is we get a real ED, sort of. We get a schwa, chatted. Really, we say a type of R there too. But just to make it clear, we'll leave that as T. T changes to R intervocalically in English. A type of R, like Spanish R or Japanese R, it sounds like this. Ara, chatted instead of chatted. In American English, my English. So in my description of my English, I would also need to indicate that. But it's not necessarily part, maybe that should be in your phonology section. It's your call. It may be hard to separate morphophonemic processes from phonological processes. So here we have some notes. I use judges in this case. And there's better vowels too. So here's some more official examples of the sound changes. To generalize, it looks like in English they like to have a voiceless sound after a voiceless sound, and a voiced sound such as Z after a voiced sound such as G. It's sometimes tricky to know the voicing of your sound, but one test in English to compare S and Z, which is the easiest one, you can hold your throat right here and make it S, and you should feel nothing. When you make a Z, however, Z, you should feel vibration. I bet you could hear it through the microphone. You could hear the difference. So that is a small note on how things change. Of course, in English, the S suffix marks certain things, but confusingly, there's also acclitic in English. Now, what is acclitic? Where did I pull this word from? Acclitic in linguistics is a term we use for something that is very similar to an affix. But instead of attaching to a word, it attaches to a whole phrase, which means sometimes it attaches to a word. So you have to be very clever to spot the clitics in your language, but there probably is one. There may not be, but you should keep an eye out. Here's some definition of clitics, just for shorthand. There's a lexicalized version of ish. I see. So the suffix can stand on its own. This is a good observation. Sorry, I looked over and saw trying to keep up with the comments. Okay, back to clitics. So the clitics attach to a phrase, and a phrase can be a single word. For example, observe the possessive S in English. You have the Queen's chair. The S marks the owner of the thing. You could say the possessor. In the case of the Queen of England's chair, There are two potential meanings. One meaning is it's the chair belonging to the Queen of England. The other meaning is that there is this thing called England's chair, and she is the queen of that, right? This ambiguity, the availability of two interpretations, is due to the fact this S clitic attaches to the phrase, the Queen of England. So when queen is ahead of the phrase, as in the Queen of England, then the chair belongs to the Queen of England. But if the S were to attach only to England, and England is the owner of the chair, in that case, the queen then is the queen of the chair, right? This ambiguity demonstrates that in our preferred interpretation, the Queen of England and her chair, it's attaching to the whole phrase. The S, if the chair belongs to the queen, this S is really modifying the head, the queen, but it attaches to the whole phrase. So these are the kind of subtle clues you need to look for to discover clitics in your language, if they are there. One good place to look for clitics is on verbs and nouns. I guess it's fairly straightforward. But in the case of verbs, sometimes the language will allow several verbs in a row. So you can have verb, verb, verb. If your language allows several verbs and something is attached to the verb, you can check if the thing that attaches modifies the last verb or a previous verb. In one language that I study, called Roviana, this is the way that you can discover a type of clitic. There are several verbs in a row, and sometimes the morpheme attached to the end is actually not modifying the last verb, indicating that it's attaching to a phrase rather than a single word. That is the diagnostic you should use to discover the difference between clitics and affixes in your language. Or you can use a noun phrase as we've done here. I think that's pretty common as well, so it's a helpful example. In the questions section, you can maybe demonstrate some things in your language or ask some questions, and I'll see if I can help troubleshoot. So, affixes and clitics and particles exist on a cline, on a scale together, you could say. So on one end, you have affixes. In the middle, you have clitics. And on the other end, you have particles. An affix must attach to a word. A clitic attaches to a phrase and has some syntactic independence. The things clitics do sometimes are a little bit different. As you notice in English, it appears that the possessive S and agreement S are the same, but they are not. You can see this distinction by how they attach. All the way on the other spectrum is particles. So you could say, as a generalization, affixes are syntactically and phonologically dependent. Clitics are phonologically dependent but syntactically independent. Particles are syntactically and phonologically independent based on their observed functions and behavior cross-linguistically. Let's talk a little bit about particles. They should be described in your morphosyntax at least, of course, by analyzing them as particles and not clitics and not affixes. You are doing a morphophonemic process analysis. You're claiming that they don't attach phonologically, though they often serve many of the same purposes as affixes and clitics. Those slight differences, that's why I mentioned syntactic independence. So here we're going to look at two types of particles in Roviana quickly. Roviana is a language spoken in the Solomon Islands. It is a language that I study and I like very much. In the first sentence, ele riu, I laughed, you get this ele particle. This indicates perfect aspect. Roviana is an Austronesian language. Many Austronesian languages lack a past tense. When I say lack a past tense, what I mean is they don't have a dedicated particle. However, every language has the ability to express events which have happened. So they use in Roviana this particle ele. And there are ways of expressing more subtle things, such as something is finished or not. This one is taken to be perfective, so meaning that something has been completed. If you're interested in a list of potential morpheme values, you can check the Leipzig gloss. It's a backwards way to do it, but it will provide a lot of things. Bernard Comrie wrote a book called Aspect, which is useful for your diagnostics. And of course, for this section, I recommend a book called Analyzing Morphosyntax by Thomas Paine to help you discover the functions. But if you can put a description of the particle in everyday words, then the description can be considered accurate. Even if you are uninterested in finding the linguistic convention used for that particular type of particle or clitic or affix. In A, we have perfect, ele, and in B, the sentence is exactly the same in this part, egeris irau. However, when you add the particle kote instead of ele, you get the meaning I will laugh instead of I have laughed. On the next page, this is just a few of the many possible morphological processes. These are some of the most common. And the first is compounding, when we put two words together. The next is reduplication, which is morphological in most Austronesian languages. And most languages of the world use reduplication for something. Many languages use reduplication for sound effects. And then what we're calling alternation, it might also be called suppletion. There are other, alternation maybe is an umbrella term for many things. It's just to try to scaffold your description. So you can say, well, there's an alternation between this, and you do not have to come up with a phonological explanation in that case. Our example of compounding is afternoon and bedroom. Observe the difference between a compound and a noun phrase. Let's say that I'm moving into a new apartment and there is a small room, and I'm wondering if there is enough room in that room for my bed. I might ask, is there bedroom? Not a super good example, but compare it when it's one word, it's bedroom in my English. So that D changes to a J in my English, bedroom, when it's one word. But if there were a situation where I was asking if there's enough room for a bed, and I asked if there's bedroom, I wouldn't say bedroom. Because when they're two separate words, the D does not change to a J. But when they are one word, the D changes to a J. This is phonological evidence, morphophonemic evidence that they are one word. You can notice changes in stress. That is a very common way of analyzing a compound cross-linguistically. You can notice changes in consonants at the boundaries. That's what I have just pointed out. That is sometimes called internal sandhi, after the Sanskrit grammarians called it, who distinguished internal changes to external changes. And this is our evidence for what makes a phonological word. When you are describing compounds in your language, you don't just have to describe the sounds. I mean, describe whatever you want. You put the limit on it. One thing you might observe is there tends to be a structure to compounds. For example, a common compound structure in English is like, for example, you put the kind of object-like thing or manner thing, the thing that the complement of the verb, the thing that goes with the verb before it. So for example, in English, you might go deer hunting in America. So if you go to hunt deer, not to hunt them, to hunt them, this would become deer hunt. Conversely, if you were to steal things, steal wallets from people's pants, to steal from pockets would be pickpocket. I am writing these with spaces. I admit I'm not very good at spelling, so I don't know if they actually have spaces or not. But in our analysis, these are one word. Type of compounding, right? I can have a good deer hunt. That's a bad pickpocket. What you observe with deer hunt is that the structure is object and verb. Another one is verb, then object. Oops, I guess this should be capital as well. So this is a salient difference in English. And indeed, once you start making lists, you can find there's some correlations. For example, many ones like pickpocket and cut purse and other pejorative ones, they tend to be pejorative. My understanding is that they're often calques from French. The English preferred word order is object verb, which makes sense with our typology. That's not super important for your description though. There's another class of compounds which can act as verbs. We tend to call this incorporation. So if I use deer hunt, I went on a deer hunt, or I went deer hunting, in that case we'll call it incorporation. It's only incorporation if it results in a verb. So some can be both. You could say, if I were a thief, I will pickpocket this afternoon, in which case it's incorporated. Another interesting example of verb object is turntable. And that might be harder to analyze, but can act, I think, only as a noun, whereas something like leapfrog, which is also a verb object, can act as both. Okay, that's some thoughts on compounding. And I'm going to put an incorporation as I brought it up. Reduplication, used for many things cross-linguistically, often used for intensifying or present tense or plural, and sometimes diminutive. A very common use is sound effects. This is how it is used in English and, to my knowledge, Japanese. In English, we do reduplication a little bit different. We do something like drip drop is a sound effect, and we change the second vowel. So there are two types. Here we have the Tagalog, two general macro types. One is full reduplication and partial reduplication. In Tagalog, you get bili to bibili for will buy, from buy. You might get Indonesian, wanita to wanita for women. I read that in a textbook. I don't speak Indonesian, so if that's wrong, just let me know. But that is an example of full reduplication, where it's completely reduplicated. Finally, we have this thing called alternation, and you should describe these if you find them. So our example is English foot to feet, where we change the vowel to inflect plural meaning, to indicate a plural meaning, I should say. We also do this with tooth and teeth and goose and geese. There's a very specific pattern in English. We also change vowels for things like sing, sang, and sung. And we call these irregular in English. Maybe a historical lens would reveal that they are the older original form and we've got new stuff. I don't know, I'm not an English scholar. But this finally starts to bring us to our discussion of syntax, which is considered very complex, but in many ways is probably the easiest thing to describe in your language. Sounds are not intuitive. You are such a master of sounds, it's entirely subconscious. But you might be more aware of syntactic changes. So syntax, simply, is the study of sentences and phrases. A phrase is a chunk made of more than one word. Sometimes just one word though too, right? So when we're looking for a chunk, the technical term is constituent equals chunk. And when I first studied syntax, I studied with this guy named Hadge Ross. And he wrote this on the walls of every single classroom: only chunks move. So when you want to identify a chunk, a syntactic unit in your language, just test if it moves. You can say, I ran up the hill test this, and you would say, up the hill is where I ran. You would say must be, in this case, up the hill is a chunk, because it can move. Conversely, you might say, I ran up the bill, meaning that the expense, the tab. In this case, it would be ungrammatical to say up the bill is where I ran. That is because in this case, actually, the bill, or ran up is the chunk. You would say the bill is what I ran up. So you could test in English sometimes the same string, run up, may be a chunk or it may not. And you can test it by moving. Once you have tested your chunks, then you need to know what they are. This is where parts of speech come in. Generally speaking, we think all languages have nouns and verbs, but the line of noun and verb is different in different languages. There is some meaning that you can use to start your diagnostics. Nouns tend to be people or objects or things or abstract items. Verbs tend to describe events, processes, states, and actions. I wish it could be more helpful than that, but most of the distinctions between nouns and verbs happen language internally. So there are languages, such as the Salish languages, to my understanding, that have a very thin distinction between nouns and verbs. English has medium distinction. In many cases, we do distinguish parts of speech, but in other cases, you can use the same thing as a noun or a verb without apparent phonological changes. For example, a word like jump. You can say, you could say, describing some kids, you could say they jump a lot. Right? Describing the same group of kids, you could say they did a good jump. Now we know in the second one it's a noun because it's preceded by a determiner, and an adjective, good. But there's no phonological change to jump. So in our description, you can describe it as a zero derivation, or you can just say that the line isn't very clear in that case. It may not be super important in your language. Perfect example, I like running, and running is fun. In these cases, they're both nouns, even though run is a verb. Prototypically, if you say I had a good run, that would be a noun. Okay, transitivity. This is a crucial part of your syntactic description. You must identify basic transitive contexts. The most important part is that it has two core arguments in a transitive. So intransitive, one core argument, Liz is sleeping. Transitive, two core arguments, Liz ate the cake. Ditransitive, three core arguments, Liz gave Bill the ball. How to know if something has two core arguments and is prototypically transitive? Well, the biggest correlating factor across all syntacticians, they seem to agree that if these things are as different and as definite as possible, you may have identified a basic transitive sentence. Once you have identified all three of these types, you can use intransitive and transitive to start classifying the alignment of your language. That may be beyond our talk today. If you get to that point, please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to help you solve that or troubleshoot it, or even just give you feedback on your current analysis. So you want to know the word order, if there's a word order. And some languages have freer word order, and some languages have more strict word order. But generally speaking, all languages allow some variation in word order, and all languages show some preference for word order. One test of the basic word order would be to use a reflexive pronoun. Now, a reflexive is the exact opposite of what we were just saying. It's two core arguments that both refer to the same thing in the real world, as opposed to two core arguments that refer to two different things in the real world. In Bill washed himself, in English, himself is the reflexive pronoun, and we know that Bill must be the subject because himself washed Bill is ungrammatical. We call this kind of thing himself an anaphor, and Bill an antecedent. Ante meaning before. So generally, across all languages in the world, it has been observed that reflexive pronouns need to be preceded in structure, or sometimes linear order, by a subject. a thing that they refer to. So this can help you determine the correct word order in your language. It's not the end-all be-all. And if you get, maybe your language does not have reflexive pronouns. There will be other things. But please send me an email if you reach that point and you're interested in those diagnostics. So types of phrases. These are some general types here. I think declarative is probably the most common type of sentence you want to use in your description. It's very, very important to describe questions, though. Right? It's important to try to describe everything possible, but some things help you really make progress when you're organizing, say, a pedagogical approach. If you want to teach the language, and if you're interested in the language for scientific reasons, then you want to describe some of the most salient basic features. Even if you were just creating a document for posterity, you want to record the biggest things. So statements and questions are the core of this. These are types of sentences, of course. Now, this is a type of phrase, a prepositional phrase. We didn't talk so much about adpositions, but they could be considered in our talk as a type of particle. So a lot of times when a particle or a preposition, it could be a postposition in your language, it could come after the nouns, but they modify a series of nouns. And we view this series of, this phrase, the noun and its article, as being inside the bigger phrase of the adposition, in this case a preposition. When you are looking for core arguments, avoid sentences which have one core argument preceded by a preposition. So I would avoid, in English, a verb like look. I look at the ball is not as good because at is a preposition. We want something unmediated by adpositions for our basic transitive sentence. Here's our activity for the day. I think you can try some of this on your own and we'll open up to questions. So record some sentence in your or a friend's languages. Always a good idea, no matter what, you can't go wrong. Try to get declarative, yes, no, and WH. See if you can get a sentence using an adpositional phrase. See if you can get one with a possessive noun phrase, as in Bill's ball or my sister's friend. Right. There you get two. Apply interlinear glossing to your sentences. What kind of affixes do you have? What is the word order? What other morphophonemic and morphosyntactic processes are there? We didn't have time to talk about case marking and agreement, voice marking. These are more advanced topics. If you get into these, please just shoot me an email, or any of the presenters I'm sure can help you. Here's what an interlinear gloss might look like. Typically, you want to put this top one in italics. And this one, you want your function words in caps or small caps. I don't know enough about French. Is this French? Is that right? Yeah, if it was Rovian, I'd know all the words. But basically, you put all the, so you might want to call this one, I don't know. I speak Portuguese, I don't know what it is. In the case that you don't know a linguistic analysis of it, I think actually using the word in another language, like English of, is pretty helpful for anybody trying to read it. Here's your activity. We're just repeating literally exactly what we just said, only with a note on glossing and translating your text. So I'll start looking at the questions, or maybe Leah has a couple organized.
Yeah, one person wanted to know what the book was that you mentioned.
Here, I'm going to write all these books right at the top. So we're going to the top. And right under what is morphology, I'm going to do recommended reading. These are off the top of my head, so hopefully. I think this is the most important one for pain. This describing morphosyntax is very helpful. I feel very knowledgeable about morphosyntax. It is my life's passion, you could say. But even when I go to do field work and study, I take this book with me. So once in a while, something comes up, I just don't know what to call it. Or maybe I'm between two things, and the book will help me decide. Maybe you don't love the book, but it will give you a very good framework of things that you should describe. And it will help you untangle some of the meanings. I believe I also mentioned Aspect by Comrie. It's a little less straightforward than the Thomas Paine book, but it is, if you're really trying to get to the bottom of a specific analysis of, say, perfect, there's multiple types of perfect, it turns out, right? There's, is it past tense? Is it perfect? Is it perfective? This might help you get to the bottom of that. Additionally, I believe Max Planck has several, let's see if those are still open. Planck, linguistic field worker tools, I believe it's called. Typological tools of field linguists. So this should be a pretty helpful place for you. Let's see, they have questionnaires, syntax, morphosyntax, semantics, phonology, really phonology questionnaire relating phonological grammatical domains of language, stress typology, that will probably be a hard one to do on your own. Here we have Sioverska's version of word order. So we'll put these tools over here. At some things that might help you get started. Does that answer that question, you think? Let me know if you're interested in more reading. And of course, I'm going to put my email right here. Hit me up with an email anytime. I'm very interested in descriptive linguistics and happy to help. Have another question?
Anna just touched on this, but if you want to look at it as well, Heather asked about creative distinction between nouns and verbs. Is pretty easy, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in Algonquin. My office mate, Ryan Hinkey, is pretty knowledgeable, actually, so maybe he's a good one to ask on that. I studied with this guy named Tim Montler, who is an expert in Klallam and Saanich language, and he demonstrated many times, so it's the wrong coast, the wrong language family, but he demonstrated many ways in which there's a very flimsy distinction between noun and verb. He published a paper showing the distinction, that there is still one. In this one isolated context, you can observe that nouns and verbs behave differently. But generally, in everyday context, they are the same. So I wouldn't be surprised if you go further east and find similar phenomena. In Austronesian, many languages have a thin distinction between noun and verb. Sometimes it seems to me like parts of a language will have a firm distinction and parts of a language will have no distinction. So for example, in English, there are verbs like eat and nouns like food, which have a very clear distinction, and there's phonologically very different. But then there's verbs like jump and nouns like jump. It's just a less clear distinction. So I wouldn't be surprised if Cree has a thin distinction or a loose distinction. It might be useful in your description to point out all the ways they are the same and then discover a context where they are different. If there's no context, that's okay too. I mean, you can't describe what isn't there. Oh, I think the document is being amended live. So if you go and check the document, it should be, maybe there's a small lag, but I've been editing it live. So if this document is shared with you, you should be able to see all the changes that I have made. Let me think on morphology. And there's this book by Nida. I'll see if that's still in publication. No point to point you towards a book that you can't get. Oh, it looks like there's several morphology books available for free. I don't know if the Nida one is available. So that might be useful actually to some people. I won't share anything like that, but you can do the same search I just did. Any more questions? It looks like we're getting there. I may have missed some things earlier in the talk. I'm going to just scroll up. Okay. Yes, sing, sang, and sung are similar to German. Because English and German are related languages, they share a common ancestor. At one time, they were the same language. So then it would seem that sing, sang, sung is the older way of doing things. Here we have describing what a morpheme looks like in normal is really important. Hello from Cameroon. What is the name of the book? Ish. I think we got everything. Okay. All right. Probably a couple more questions if we let it go, but I encourage you to take down my email and send me an email with your questions or your analysis, even if you just want a second look at it. Be happy to give you my thoughts. And I'm sure also Anna Baloo is a very good one to ask. And Kevin, who has a Chinese name on his Facebook, so you have to know he's the one who said happy is the core part of life. He's pretty good at this type of analysis as well. And of course, Leah is as well. So you have many people to ask, but I'm happy to help. I hope that you guys have enjoyed. It looks like we're out of time, so. Oh, 2 more questions. Okay, while I was rambling, they popped up. Okay, in the case of lots of phonological and morphological variation in the variety of language you're describing, or the regional origin. So I would recommend that you document all variation within a single language, within a single speaker. Of course, documenting variation between speakers is important, and documenting variation between communities is important too. But for a concise description, you want to base it on like an ideal system. So it's better to say there are 2 different types of projects. There's a sociolinguistic project where you go and document all the variation of different communities and different speakers, and it's important too. Before you do that, though, it might be helpful to have a very good understanding of a single variety. So I would say that if you have this within a single person, you must try to get to the bottom of all the variation. Sometimes these variations are called free variation when we cannot discover a principled reason for the variation. However, there may be a principled reason that we just haven't discovered. John O Papa Wa Son Xian. That must mean, I understand this to mean John's dad's dog. Some people say word order is free in Michif and Cree, but I'm not sure that is always the case. Otherwise, the phrase could mean John's dog's dad. Excellent point. So there is this thing called animacy hierarchy, which is an idea. We have a mental representation that certain things are more animate than others. So despite the word order, our pragmatic knowledge of the world will overcome the word order and we'll have the interpretation that makes most sense in the real world. And I know that this is, well, I've read that this is a common phenomena of North American languages. So I wouldn't be surprised if that accounts for the supposed variation or the observed variation in Cree. And I think that if you were to run some diagnostics and some experiments, there is a linguist here named Ivan Bondok who runs experiments on word order in Tagalog. Many people had claimed that the word order is completely free in Tagalog, but he has discovered some cognitive evidence that there is preferred word orders, despite things can be recovered by the way they mark their nouns. You can recover meaning in all sorts of contexts. So you can move the words a lot, but there is kind of a deeper feeling of maybe there is one word order that's preferred as default, though many are grammatical. Let's see. Going down, a couple more comments. Oh, I missed 2 comments. Okay, yes, somebody else said they like Payne's book. Excellent. If you guys have any more, it looks like our time is up. Although I'm happy if you have a last minute question, I'll stick around and answer it. But otherwise, please send me an email once you get trying. And you may get into this morphosyntax book and decide you hate it and it's very confusing. Just send me a question. I can at least tell you what I think. We good for today? Anything else? All right, excellent. It was a pleasure to share this with you guys, and I hope that you have great luck investigating the morphology and syntax of your language. Okay, now we're going to get off. I'll end our stream now. I can talk for 5 hours.